The fire crackled softly as we sat around it, the warmth contrasting with the chilly night air. The towering pines surrounded us, their silhouettes barely visible against the darkening sky. The silence in the forest was almost unnatural, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. As the night wore on, an eerie feeling settled over me, making the shadows seem deeper and the silence heavier. I couldn't shake the sensation that we weren't alone. Suddenly, a low rustling sound came from just beyond the circle of light cast by the fire. My heart skipped a beat as I glanced at my friends, who seemed equally tense. We all exchanged nervous looks, but said nothing, each of us trying to dismiss the sound as an animal or the wind. Yet the unease lingered, and my mind raced with possibilities. What if it was something more sinister? As the minutes dragged on, the rustling grew louder and more frequent. My pulse quickened, and I could feel my breath growing shallow. I forced myself to think logically. It had to be an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, the fear gnawed at me, making my skin crawl. The others remained quiet, but their eyes darted nervously toward the darkness. Just when I thought my nerves couldn't take it anymore, something brushed against the side of the tent. It was a light touch, but it sent a jolt of fear through me, and I froze in place. My friends and I stared at each other, wide-eyed, each of us too terrified to move or speak. The night had taken on a life of its own, and we were caught in its grip, waiting for whatever was out there to reveal itself. The air inside the tent felt stifling as we sat in silence, straining to hear any more sounds from outside. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could see the same fear mirrored in the eyes of my friends. The rustling had stopped, but the tension remained thick. We knew we had to decide what to do next: stay inside and hope for the best, or step outside and face whatever was out there. The thought of confronting the unknown sent a chill down my spine. After what felt like an eternity, one of my friends, Mark, finally broke the silence. "We should check it out," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. The others nodded in reluctant agreement, though none of us seemed eager to move. Slowly, we unzipped the tent and stepped out into the night, the cold air hitting us like a slap. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sound coming from the crackling fire that had burned down to embers. As we stepped further away from the tent, something caught my eye. A series of strange footprints in the dirt, leading away from our campsite. They were large, too large to belong to any animal I could think of, and they appeared to have been made by someone, or something, walking on two legs. My stomach churned as I pointed them out to the others. "What the hell made those?" I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. No one had an answer. We followed the footprints with a mix of dread and curiosity, our flashlights illuminating the path ahead. Each step felt heavier than the last, the oppressive silence only amplifying our fear. As we reached the edge of the clearing, we suddenly heard it. A faint, desperate cry for help coming from deep within the woods. It was a sound that sent a shiver down my spine and left us frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. The cry echoed through the trees, faint but unmistakable. It was a sound that pulled at our instincts, urging us to help. Despite the fear gnawing at my insides, I couldn't ignore it. "We have to go after it," I said, my voice trembling. Mark nodded, and together, we started toward the source of the sound, each step taking us deeper into the dark, unforgiving woods. The others hesitated, but eventually followed, their faces pale with fear. The forest seemed to close in around us as we moved further away from the safety of our campsite. The once welcoming trees now loomed ominously overhead, their branches twisting together like skeletal hands. The ground beneath our feet was uneven, and every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made my heart jump. Despite the growing fear, we pressed on, driven by the need to find the person who had called out. As we walked, the feeling of being watched became almost unbearable. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every rustle in the underbrush felt like a hidden threat. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be lurking out there. Something that had left those strange footprints and now waited, unseen, for us to make a mistake. I could see the same thoughts reflected in the faces of my friends as they glanced nervously around, their grips tightening on the flashlights. Finally, we broke through the dense underbrush and found ourselves standing in front of an old abandoned cabin. It was a small structure, its wooden walls weathered and covered in moss, with broken windows that stared out like empty eyes. The cry for help had led us here, but now, standing in front of the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had walked into a trap. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to gather the courage to take the next step. The cabin loomed before us, its darkened interior inviting yet foreboding. Mark was the first to move, cautiously stepping toward the creaking door that hung slightly ajar. My heart pounded in my ears as I followed, the others close behind. The air inside was thick with the scent of decay, and the floorboards groaned under our weight. The dim light from our flashlights cast long shadows that danced on the walls, making the small space feel even more oppressive. We searched the room, finding signs that someone had been there recently. A torn backpack, a half-burned candle, and a scattering of old yellowed papers on a makeshift table. But there was no sign of the person who had called for help. As we carefully examined the papers, Mark found a journal with frantic, scrawled entries. The last entry was dated just a few days ago, and it detailed the writer's desperate attempts to escape something stalking them in the woods. The realization sent a chill down my spine. Whatever had been hunting them was still out there. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the same cry for help, now much closer, almost as if it were coming from just outside the cabin. My pulse quickened, and without thinking, we rushed to the door, ready to face whatever was out there. But instead of a sinister presence, we found a disheveled camper, their clothes torn and eyes wide with terror. They were trembling, barely able to speak, as they told us how they'd been lost in the woods for days, stalked by an unseen predator. Relief washed over me as we helped the camper inside the cabin. It became clear that the strange occurrences and footprints were all part of the camper's desperate attempts to escape. As dawn broke, we led the camper back to our site, grateful that the nightmarish ordeal had come to an end without any of us being harmed. The light of the new day brought a sense of triumph, and as we packed up to leave, I couldn't help but feel a deep appreciation for the safety and warmth of the morning sun. The fog rolled in thick and heavy as we set up our tents by the edge of the lake. The water was eerily still, reflecting the darkening sky above. There was an unnatural silence in the air, broken only by the occasional splash of a fish or the distant call of a bird. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, strange lights began to flicker across the lake, catching my eye. They were faint at first, just tiny glimmers in the mist, But soon, they grew brighter, more distinct, almost as if they were moving toward us. My heart raced as I pointed out the lights to my friends. "What do you think that is?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. They all turned to look, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. We stood there, watching in silence as the lights danced across the water, casting ghostly reflections that seemed to stretch out toward us. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that those lights weren't just an ordinary phenomenon. As the minutes passed, the light suddenly vanished, plunging us into darkness. The abruptness of it made my skin crawl, and I could see the same fear reflected in my friend's eyes. We exchanged nervous glances, each of us trying to come up with a rational explanation for what we had just seen. But deep down, I knew there was something more to it, something that defied logic. The silence that followed was oppressive, as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting. Without warning, a cold wind swept across the lake, sending chills down my spine. The fog thickened, obscuring everything beyond a few feet in front of us. I felt a growing sense of dread, a primal instinct telling me to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. But I couldn't move, couldn't tear my eyes away from the dark, still water that now seemed so ominous. We were all frozen in place, caught between fear and fascination, waiting for something to happen. The fog pressed in around us. The lights across the lake had vanished as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving us with nothing but questions and a gnawing sense of unease. We gathered closer, speaking in hushed tones as we tried to make sense of what we had seen. Could it be from another campsite? Mark suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. The idea seemed plausible, but something deep inside told me there was more to it than that. After a tense discussion, we decided to investigate. None of us wanted to venture into the unknown, but curiosity and a sense of duty to uncover the truth drove us forward. We found an old rowboat tied to a nearby dock, its wood creaking as we stepped inside. The fog had grown so thick that we could barely see the outline of the shore as we pushed off, the oars slicing through the dark water with eerie silence. The only sound was the rhythmic splash of the oars, each stroke pulling us deeper into the unknown. As we rowed across the lake, the fog seemed to close in even tighter. My breath caught in my throat when I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, coming from the water below. I stopped rowing, my hands trembling on the oars, and strained to listen. The others must have heard it too, because they looked at me with wide eyes, their faces pale in the dim light. "Did you hear that?" I asked. No one answered. We were all listening now, ears straining to catch the elusive sound. The whisper came again, this time more distinct, like a voice speaking just below the surface of the water. My heart pounded in my chest as the realization dawned on me. There was something in the lake, something that had been watching us, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. The whispers grew louder, surrounding us, filling the air with an overwhelming sense of dread. I could feel the fear gripping me tighter, and for the first time, I wondered if we had made a terrible mistake by coming here. The whispers seemed to echo all around us, rising and falling like the breath of some unseen entity. My heart raced as we continued across the lake, each stroke of the oars feeling like it brought us closer to something we weren't meant to find. The fog was so thick now that we couldn't see the shore on either side, only the inky black water beneath us and the pale outlines of each other's faces. The fear in my friend's eyes mirrored my own, but none of us spoke. We were all too terrified of what might happen if we did. Finally, the boat bumped against something solid, and we realized we had reached the opposite shore. The whispers stopped, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. We stepped out onto the wet, rocky ground, our footsteps muffled by the thick layer of mist that clung to the earth. Ahead of us, through the dense fog, we could just make out the shape of another campsite. It was eerily quiet, the tents sagging under the weight of moisture, but there was no sign of life. As we cautiously approached, I noticed something strange. There were signs that someone had been here recently. The fire pit still had embers glowing faintly, and there were fresh footprints in the mud leading away from the tents. But where was everyone? The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. Had the campers fled in a hurry, or had something driven them away? We searched the campsite, our fear mounting with each passing second. I felt a deep sense of foreboding as we uncovered more strange details. Items scattered carelessly, as if abandoned in haste, and a single, half-finished meal left untouched on a makeshift table. But the most unsettling discovery was a notebook lying near the entrance of one of the tents. The pages were filled with cryptic entries detailing the lights we had seen and strange occurrences around the lake. The last entry, written in shaky handwriting, warned of something coming from the water, something that couldn't be stopped. We were trapped, with no choice but to face whatever was coming. The lights pulsed and flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows that danced across the water and the shore. My friends huddled together, our fear palpable in the cold night air. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, like a chorus of voices just beyond our comprehension. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but there was no logic here. Only the overwhelming sense that we had crossed into a place we weren't meant to be. Suddenly, the lights converged on the boat, and everything went still. The whispers stopped. The fog seemed to hold its breath, and for a moment, there was nothing but the pounding of my heart in my ears. Then, without warning, the boat jerked violently, as if something had grabbed hold of it from beneath the water. We screamed, holding on for dear life as the boat rocked and spun, the lights now swirling around us in a dizzying pattern. The sense of helplessness was suffocating, and I could feel my grip on reality slipping. Just as quickly as it began, the chaos stopped. The boat stilled, the lights vanished, and we were left in darkness once again. The fog began to lift, revealing the shore we had come from, not more than a few feet away. It was as if we had never crossed the lake at all, as if the entire experience had been some twisted illusion. We were too shaken to speak, too terrified to question what had happened. We simply rowed back to our campsite in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. When we reached the shore, we found the campsite exactly as we had left it, untouched and undisturbed. There was no sign of the lights, no whispers, no evidence that anything out of the ordinary had occurred, but the notebook remained in my hand, a tangible reminder that we hadn't imagined it all. We packed up our things and left that place as quickly as we could, never once looking back. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the lake still watched us, that whatever lived beneath its surface was waiting for the next group of campers to come along. And as we disappeared into the night, I knew we would never truly understand what we had experienced, nor would we ever speak of it again. The mountains rose up around us, their peaks shrouded in low-hanging clouds as we set up camp in a secluded clearing. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of pine and earth, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant call of a bird. My partner and I had chosen this spot for its tranquility, a perfect escape from the noise and chaos of the city. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. That night, as we sat by the fire, the quiet of the mountains began to feel oppressive, almost unnatural. The flames flickered and crackled, but the darkness beyond the ring of light seemed to press in on us, heavy and impenetrable. I tried to focus on the warmth of the fire and the comfort of my partner's presence, but there was something unsettling about the night, an almost tangible tension in the air. It wasn't long before the silence was broken by a low, haunting sound echoing through the mountains. At first, I dismissed it as the wind, or perhaps an animal in the distance, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just a random noise. It was a series of strange, rhythmic tones that seemed to come from all around us. My heart began to race as I listened, trying to make sense of it. My partner looked at me, their eyes wide with concern. "Do you hear that?" they whispered, their voice barely audible over the sound. I nodded, my stomach churning with unease. The sound seemed to pulse in the air, growing and fading like a heartbeat. The firelight flickered as the wind picked up, carrying the strange noises through the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something out there in the darkness was aware of us. My partner and I exchanged a nervous glance, neither of us wanting to voice the fear that was slowly creeping into our minds. We were no longer alone in these mountains. The next morning, the unsettling events of the night before lingered in my mind, casting a shadow over the bright, clear day. We decided to explore the area, hoping to shake off the eerie feeling that had settled between us. The mountains were beautiful, the air fresh and invigorating, but I couldn't help noticing how quiet it was. Even the birds seemed subdued, their songs muted in the vast expanse of the wilderness. As we hiked deeper into the forest, my unease only grew. It wasn't long before we stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. Carved into the bark of a tall pine tree were strange symbols, their meanings unknown to me. They were crude, almost primitive, yet they carried an ominous energy that made my skin crawl. My partner and I exchanged a worried glance, both of us thinking the same thing. Someone or something had left these markings, and they weren't meant to be welcoming. The atmosphere grew heavy with tension as we continued our hike, the forest around us now feeling less like a peaceful retreat and more like a place we didn't belong. As we ventured further, we found more of the strange symbols, each one more elaborate and foreboding than the last. They were carved into trees, rocks, and even the ground in some places, as if to mark a path we were unknowingly following. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying faint, almost imperceptible voices that seemed to speak in a language I couldn't understand. My partner's hand tightened around mine, their grip the only thing keeping me grounded as the world around us seemed to shift and warp. We pressed on, driven by a mix of curiosity and fear, until we came across something that stopped us in our tracks. A hidden cave, its entrance partially obscured by overgrown vines and brush. It was dark inside, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow the light whole. A sense of foreboding washed over me as I stared into the abyss, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. But my partner, always the braver of the two of us, insisted we take a closer look. Reluctantly, I agreed, though every fiber of my being told me it was a mistake. The cave's entrance loomed before us, dark and foreboding, as if it were a mouth waiting to swallow us whole. With a deep breath, we stepped inside, our flashlights piercing the inky blackness, but revealing little beyond the damp stone walls. The air inside was thick and musty, carrying a faint metallic scent that set my nerves on edge. Each step echoed in the narrow space, amplifying the sound and making it feel as though something was moving just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. As we ventured deeper, the walls of the cave began to close in around us, the passage narrowing until we had to walk single file. The strange symbols we had seen outside reappeared here, etched into the stone with unnerving precision. They seemed to pulse in the light of our flashlights, as if alive with some ancient, malevolent energy. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was following us through the twisting corridors of the cave. Then we found it, the source of the strange markings and the unease that had plagued us since our arrival. In a small chamber at the back of the cave, we discovered an old journal, its pages yellowed with age. The cover was worn and tattered, and as I opened it, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The journal belonged to a group of campers who had been here decades ago, and their entries told a story of growing paranoia, strange occurrences, and an overwhelming sense of being hunted by an unseen force. As I read, my hands trembled, the words on the page echoing the very fears that had been gnawing at me since we first heard those strange noises in the night. The final entry was the most disturbing of all. It described how one by one the group had disappeared, leaving the last survivor alone in the darkness, writing desperately in the hopes that someone, someday, would find their words. The entry ended abruptly, the writing frantic and barely legible, as if the author had been interrupted by something they couldn't escape. I looked up at my partner, my voice barely more than a whisper. "We need to get out of here." But before they could respond, a sound echoed through the cave, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper that sent a cold wave of fear through me. It was the same sound we had heard that first night, and it was closer now, much closer. We hurried back to our campsite, our nerves frayed and our thoughts scattered. The strange symbols, the journal, the whispers, none of it made sense. Yet it all pointed to something ancient and malevolent that lurked in those mountains. We quickly packed up our belongings, neither of us speaking, both desperate to leave that place behind. As we loaded our gear into the car, I felt a sense of urgency, like we were racing against time, trying to escape before something caught up with us. But just as we were about to drive away, my partner realized they had left the journal behind. "I'll go get it," they said, before I could stop them. My heart sank as I watched them run back toward the trail leading to the cave. Every instinct told me to shout, to stop them, but fear and uncertainty paralyzed me. Minutes passed, and they didn't return. The unease I had felt since we arrived now twisted into pure dread. I waited, calling out their name, but only silence answered me. We hurried back to our campsite, our nerves frayed and our thoughts scattered. The strange symbols, the journal, the whispers, none of it made sense. Yet it all pointed to something ancient and malevolent that lurked in those mountains. We quickly packed up our belongings, neither of us speaking, both desperate to leave that place behind. As we loaded our gear into the car, I felt a sense of urgency, like we were racing against time, trying to escape before something caught up with us. But just as we were about to drive away, my partner realized they had left the journal behind. "I'll go get it," they said, before I could stop them. My heart sank as I watched them run back toward the trail leading to the cave. Every instinct told me to shout, to stop them, but fear and uncertainty paralyzed me. Minutes passed, and they didn't return. The unease I had felt since we arrived now twisted into pure dread. I waited, calling out their name, but only silence answered me. Finally, I couldn't stand it any longer. I ran back down the trail, my heart pounding in my ears. The cave entrance was just ahead, but there was no sign of my partner. I called out again, my voice echoing back at me, but still nothing. The forest around me seemed to hold its breath, and the realization struck me like a cold, hard truth. Something had taken them, and they weren't coming back. The sadness and despair were overwhelming as I stood there, alone, with the weight of what had happened settling in. I knew I couldn't stay, but leaving felt like a betrayal. With tears in my eyes, I turned and walked away, knowing I would never forget the horrors we had encountered in those mountains, nor the love I had lost to the darkness within.